Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. Episode 37. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. You should watch Rick and Morty, and you should reach out for any of the sci-fi references made in that film that you don't understand. You will be amazed at how I expanded my personal literary horizons by watching The Simpsons for 20 years or something like that. It came out when I was a very small child for the first time. And I literally went through a literary reinvention of myself by actually reading everything Lisa Simpson ever referenced in book form. And that is by itself an extraordinary geek-specific, mind-expanding sort of approach that you should definitely take all the way down to the fact that Ricks from other universes call our protagonist Rick C-137. All of this is backed up by contemporary physics. It is extraordinarily geek-tastic. You are listening to Fireside Tales for Wolfgang, originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura, on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media. I've, in the past, read a couple of stories by an author that I had never truly appreciated until starting Fireside Tales. Hammond Garland has written some really neat stuff that we've shared together in the past. To continue in that trend of really neat stuff, this is called A Day's Pleasure by Hammond Garland. When Markham came in from shoveling his last wagon load of corn into the crib, he found that his wife had put the children to bed and was kneading a batch of dough with the dogged action of a tired and sullen woman. He slipped his soggy boots off his feet and, having laid a pile of wood upon the stove, put his heels on it comfortably. His chair squeaked as he leaned back on its hinder legs, but he paid no attention. He was used to it, exactly as he was used to his wife's lameness and ceaseless toil. "That closes up my corn," he said after a silence. "Guess I'll go to town tomorrow and get my horses shod." "Well, I guess I'll get ready and go along," said his wife in a sorry attempt to be firm and confident of tone. "What do you want to go into town for?" he grumbled. "What does anybody want to go to town for?" she burst out, facing him. "I ain't been out of this house for 6 months while you go and go." "Oh, it ain't 6 months. You went down the day I got the mower." "Oh, when was that?" "The 10th of July, and you know it." "Well, maybe 'twas. I didn't think it was so long ago. I ain't no objection to your going. I'm only going to take a load of wheat." "Well, just leave off a sack and that'll balance me and the baby," she said spiritedly. "All right," he repeated good-naturedly, seeing she was roused. "Only the wheat ought to be put up tonight if you're going. You won't have any time to hold sacks for me in the morning with them youngins to get off to school." "Well, let's do it then," she said, suddenly resolute. "I hate to go out again, but I suppose we better." He yawned dismally and began pulling his boots on again, stamping his swollen feet into them with grunts of pain. She put on his coat, and one of the boys' caps, and they went out to the granary. The night was cold and clear. "Don't look so much like snow as it did last night," said Sam. "May turn warm." Sam climbed into the granary bin, and the work began. The cold wheat dragged heavily on the woman's tired hands, and she trembled with fatigue, but kept on, and dragged the sacks away when filled, and brought others, till at last Sam climbed out, puffing and wheezing to tie them up. "I guess I'll load 'em in the morning," he said. The moon had scarcely set when they were wakened by the crowing roosters. The man rolled stiffly out of bed and began rattling at the stove in the dark, cold kitchen. His wife arose, lamer and stiffer than usual, and began twisting her thin hair into a knot. Sam did not stop to wash, but went out to the barn. The woman, however, hastily soused her face with the hard limestone water at the sink and put the kettle on. Then she called the children. She pushed breakfast forward, running over her mind the things she must have: 2 spools of thread, 6 yards of cotton flannel, a can of coffee, and mittens for Catherine. These she must have. There were oceans of things she needed. The children soon came scudding down out of the darkness and the upstairs to dress tumultuously at the kitchen stove. They shivered and held up their bare feet from the cold floor like chickens in new fallen snow. They ate their breakfast by lamplight, and when Sam went back to his work around the barnyard, it was scarcely dawn. The children, left alone with their mother, began to cease. Began to tease her to let them go to town also. "No, sir, nobody goes but baby. Your father's going to take a load of wheat." She was weak with the work of it all when she had sent the older children away to school, and the kitchen clearing was finally finished. She went into the cold bedroom off the little sitting room and put on her best dress. It had never been a good fit, and now she was getting so thin that it hung in wrinkled folds everywhere about the shoulders and waist. She lay down on the bed a moment to ease that dull pain in her back. She had a moment's distaste for going out at all. The thought of sleep was more alluring. Then the thought of the long, long day and the sickening sameness of her life swept over her again, and she rose and prepared the baby for the journey. It was only a little after sunrise when Sam drove out into the road and started for Bellaplain. His wife sat perched upon the wheat sacks behind him, holding the baby in her lap, a cotton quilt under her, and a horse blanket over her knees. It grew warmer as they went on, and a strong south wind arose. The dust settled upon the woman's shawl and hat. Her hair loosened and blew unkemptly about her face. The road, which led across the high, level prairie, was quite smooth and dry, but still it jolted her, and the pain in her back increased. She had nothing to lean against, and the weight of the child grew greater till she was forced to place him on the sacks beside her, though she could not lose her hold for a moment. The town drew in sight, a cluster of small frame houses and stores on the dry prairie beside a railway station. There were no trees yet, which could be called shade trees. The pitiless, severe light of the sun flooded everything. A few teams were hitched about, and in the lee of the stores, a few men could be seen seated comfortably, their broad-rimmed hats flopping up and down as they talked, their faces brown as leather. Markham put his wife out at one of the grocery stores and drove off down toward the elevators to sell his wheat. The grocer greeted Mrs. Markham in a perfunctory kind of manner and offered her a chair, which she took gratefully. She sat for a quarter of an hour, almost without moving, leaning against the back of the high chair. At last, the child began to get restless and troublesome, and she spent half an hour helping to amuse him. At length, she rose and went out onto the walk, carrying the baby. She went into the dry goods store and took a seat on one of the little revolving stools. A woman was buying some woolen goods for a dress. It was worth 27 cents a yard, the clerk said, but he would knock off 2 cents if she took 10 yards. It looked warm, and Mrs. Markham wished she could afford it for Mary. A pretty young girl came in and laughed and chatted with the clerk and bought a pair of gloves. When Sam came back, she asked him for some money. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "I want to spend it," she said. She was not to be trifled with, so he gave her $1. "I need $1 more. The children's got to have some new underclothes," she said. He handed her a $2 bill and then went out to pay his note at the bank. She bought cotton flannel and mittens and thread and then sat leaning against the counter. It was noon, and she was hungry. She went out to the wagon, got the lunch she had bought, and took it into the grocery to eat it where she could get a drink of water. The grocer gave the baby a stick of candy and handed the mother an apple. "You go down kindly with your donuts," he said. After eating her lunch, she got up and went out. She felt ashamed to sit there any longer. She entered another dry goods store, but when the clerk came toward her saying, "Anything today, miss?" she answered, No, I guess not," and turned away feeling a bit foolish. She walked up and down the street, desolately homeless. She did not know what to do with herself. She knew no one except the grocer. She grew bitter as she saw a couple of ladies pass, holding their demi-trains in the latest city fashion. Another woman went by, pushing a baby carriage in which sat a child just about as big as her own. It was bouncing itself up and down on the long, slender springs and laughing and shouting. Its clean, round face glowed from its pretty fringed hood. She looked down at the dusty clothes and grimy face of her own little one and walked on savagely. She went into the drugstore where the soda fountain was, but made her thirsty to sit there, and she went out to the street again. She heard Sam laugh and saw him in a group of men over by the blacksmith shop. He was having a good time and had forgotten her. Her back ached so intolerably that she concluded to go in and rest once more in the grocer's chair. The baby was growing cross and fretful. She bought 5 cents worth of candy to take home to the children and gave the baby just a little piece to keep him quiet. She wished Sam would come. It must be getting late. The grocer said it was not much after 1. Time seemed terribly long. She felt that she ought to do something. While she was in town, she ran over her purchases. Yes, she had all she had planned to buy. She fell to figuring on the things she needed. It was terrible. It ran away up into $20 or $30 at the least. Sam, as well as she, needed underwear for the cold winter, but they would have to wear the old ones, even if they were thin and ragged. She would not need a dress, she thought bitterly, because she never went anywhere. She rose and went out on the street once more and wandered up and down, looking at everything in the hope of enjoying something. A man from Boone Creek backed a load of apples up onto the sidewalk. As he stood waiting for the grocer, he noticed Mrs. Markham and the baby, and he gave the baby an apple. This was a pleasure. He had such a hearty way about him. He, on his part, saw an ordinary farmer's wife with dusty dress, unkempt hair, and tired face. He did not know exactly why she caught his attention, but he tried to cheer her up. The grocer was familiar with these bedraggled and weary wives. He was accustomed to see them sit for hours in his big wooden chair and nurse tired and fretful children. Their forlorn, aimless, pathetic wandering up and down the street was a daily occurrence and had never possessed any special meaning to him. In a cottage around the corner from the grocery store, 2 men and a woman were finishing a dainty luncheon. The woman was dressed in cool white garments, and she seemed to make the day one of perfect comfort. This home of the Honorable Mr. Hall was by no means the costliest in the town, but his wife made it the most attractive. He was one of the leading lawyers of the county and a man of culture and progressive views. He was entertaining a friend who had lectured the night before in the Congregational Church. They were by no means in serious discussion. The talk was rather casual. Hall had the ability to caricature men with a few gestures and attitudes, and was given to his Eastern friends some descriptions of the old-fashioned Western lawyers he had met in his practice. He was very amusing, and his guests laughed heartily. But suddenly Otis was not listening and was peering out of the window at someone, and a look of bitter sadness crept onto his face. Hall stopped. "What do you see, Otis?" Otis replied, "I see a forlorn, weary woman." Mrs. Hall rose and went to the window. Mrs. Markham was walking by the house, her baby in her arms. Savage anger and weeping were in her eyes and on her lips, and there was hopeless tragedy in her shambling walk. In the silence, Otis went on. "I saw the poor, dejected creature twice this morning. I couldn't forget her." "Who is she?" asked Mrs. Hall, very softly. Her name is Markham. She's Sam Markham's wife," said Hall. The young wife led the way into the sitting room, and the men took seats and lit their cigars. Hall was meditating a diversion when Otis resumed suddenly, "That woman came to town today to get a change, to have a little play spell, and she's wandering around like a starved and weary cat. I wonder if there's a woman in this town with sympathy enough and courage enough to go out and help her. The saloon keepers, the politicians, the grocers make it pleasant for the man, so pleasant that he forgets his wife, but the wife is left without a word." Mrs. Hall's work dropped, and on her pretty face was a look of pain. The man's harsh words had wounded her and wakened her. She took up her hat and hurried out on the walk. The men looked at each other, and then the husband said, "Suppose we go out for a walk." Delia felt a hand on her arm as she stood at the corner. You look tired, Mrs. Markham. Won't you come in a little while? I'm Mrs. Hall. Delia Markham turned with a scowl on her face and a biting word on her tongue, but something in the sweet, round little face of the other woman silenced her, and her brow smoothed out. Well, thank you kindly, but it's most time to go home. I'm looking for Mr. Markham now. Oh, come in a little while. The baby is cross and tired out. Please do. Mrs. Markham yielded to the friendly voice, and together the two women reached the gate just as two men hurriedly turned to the other corner. Let me relieve you, said Mrs. Hall. The mother hesitated. Oh, he's so dusty. Oh, that won't matter. Oh, what a big fellow he is. I haven't any of my own, said Mrs. Hall, and a look passed like an electric spark between the two women, and Delia was her willing guest from that moment. They went into the little sitting room, so dainty and lovely to the farmer's wife, and as she sank into an easy chair, she was faint and drowsy with the pleasure of it. She submitted to being brushed. She gave the baby into the hands of the Swedish girl, who washed its face and sang it to sleep while its mother sipped some tea. Through it all, Delia laid back in her easy chair, not speaking a word, while the ache passed out of her back and her hot, swollen head ceased to throb. But she saw everything. The piano, the pictures, the curtains, the wallpaper, the little tea stand. They were almost as delightful to her as the food and fragrant tea. Such housekeeping as this she had never seen. Her mother had worn her kitchen floor thin as brown paper in keeping a speckless house, and Delia had been in houses that were larger and costlier, but here there was a charm of her hostess in the arrangement of vases, chairs, or pictures. It was tasteful. Mrs. Hall did not ask about Mrs. Markham's affairs. She talked to her about the sturdy little baby and about the things upon which Delia's eyes dwelt. If she seemed interested in a vase, she was told what it was and where it was made. She was shown all the pictures and books. Mrs. Hall seems to read her visitor's mind. She kept as far from the farm and her guests' affairs as possible, and at last she opened the piano and sang to her. Not slow-moving hymns, but catchy love songs, full of sentiment, and then played some simple melodies, knowing that Mrs. Markham's eyes were studying her hands, her rings, and the flash of her fingers on the keys, seeing more than she heard, and through it all, Mrs. Hall conveyed the impression that she, too, was having a good time. The rattle of the wagon outside roused them both. Sam was at the gate for her. Mrs. Markham rose hastily. Oh, it's almost sundown, she gasped in astonishment as she looked out of the window. Oh, that won't kill anybody, replied her hostess. Don't hurry. Carrie, please take the baby out to the wagon for Mrs. Markham while I help her with her things. Oh, I've had such a good time, Mrs. Markham said as they went down the little walk. So have I, replied Mrs. Hall. She took the baby a moment as her guest climbed in. Oh, you big fat fellow, she cried as she gave him a squeeze. You must bring your wife in oftener, Mr. Markham, she said as she handed the baby up. Sam was staring with amazement. Thank you. I will, he finally managed to say. Good night, said Mrs. Markham. Good night, dear, called Mrs. Hall, and the wagon began to rattle off. The tenderness and sympathy in her voice brought the tears to Delia's eyes. Not hot nor bitter tears, but tears that cooled her eyes and cleared her mind. The wind had gone down, and the red sunlight fell mistily over the world of corn and stubble. The crickets were still chirping, and the feeding cattle were drifting toward the farmyards. The day had been made beautiful by human sympathy. I've always found Lord Byron to be a fascinating character. The man died in a foreign war that he was fighting in, not because he had to, not because he had any social obligation, but because it was a war he believed in. This is a man who was not naturally, well, he was flamboyant. He was known for his personal beauty. Apparently he was a good-looking chap. George Gordon, Lord Byron, who was a major English romantic poet. This is romanticism with a capital R. He was the most fashionable poet of the early 1880s. Now, I don't know what the modern pop culture equivalent of a fashionable poet would be, but I can't think of a cooler history label that may be laden about one's shoulders. How neat. Fashionable poet. He created an immensely popular romantic hero, defiant, melancholy, haunted by secret guilt. He seemed to be the model for all of these things. He was a peer of the realm. He championed liberty in his works and in his deeds by giving money, time, energy. He had his athletic side as a competent competent boxer, horse rider. He was apparently an excellent swimmer. Funny enough, I may be misremembering this, but I think I recall from another source that he also had a club foot. So I noticed in his list of athletic accomplishments, sprinter or distance runner is not in. Byron was known in his lifetime for his aristocratic excesses, which included huge debts, numerous love affairs, rumors of a scandalous, incestuous liaison with his half-sister, and a self-imposed exile. I wonder if I can sort of relate to self-imposed exile, having spent 1.5 years in Big Bear. On the other hand, there was this thing that was really popular in 2020. We called it a plague. Lord Byron was famously described by Lady Caroline Lamb as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. It's been speculated by historians that he may have suffered a bipolar disorder. He died at 36 from a fever contracted while in Greece. So, fascinatingly passionate guy. Lord Byron said, I can never get people to understand that poetry is the expression of excited passion, and that there's no such thing as a life of passion any more than a continuous earthquake or an eternal fever. Pretty neat, insightful guy. I would love to be able to resurrect and have a few conversations with. And as I said, he was friends with the Shelleys, Mary Shelley and her husband Percy Shelley. I'm just going to read one poem after that introduction. Lord Byron published this in 1813. You will recognize it. This is She Walks in Beauty by George Gordon, otherwise known as Lord Byron. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and light meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek, and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm yet eloquent, that smiles that win, the tints that glow but tells of days and goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. So got a little section out of Walden from chapter 5 called Solitude. This is abridged slightly, but I hope we all get something out of this. From Walden by Henry David Thoreau, chapter 5. This piece is called Solitude. This is a delicious evening when the whole body is one sense and imbibes delight through every pore. I go and come with a strange liberty in nature, a part of herself. As I walk along the stony shore of the pond in my shirt sleeves, though it is cool as well as cloudy and windy, and I see nothing special to attract me, all the elements are unusually congenial to me. The bullfrogs trumpet to usher in the night, and the note of the whippoorwill is borne on the rippling wind from over the water. Sympathy with the fluttering alder and poplar leaves almost takes away my breath, yet, like the lake, my serenity is rippled, but not ruffled. These small waves raised by the evening wind are as remote from storm as the smooth reflecting surface. Though it is now dark, the wind still blows and roars in the wood. The waves still dash, and some creatures lull the rest with their notes. The repose is never complete. The wildest animals do not repose, but seek their prey now. The fox and the skunk and rabbit now roam the fields and woods without fear. They are nature's watchmen, links which connect the days of animated life. When I return to my house, I find that visitors have been there and left their cards, either a bunch of flowers or a wreath of evergreen, or a name in pencil on a yellow walnut leaf, or a chip. They who come rarely to the woods take some little piece of the forest into their hands to play with, by the way, which they leave either intentionally or accidentally. One has peeled a willow wand, woven it into a ring, and dropped it on my table. I could always tell if visitors had called in my absence, either by the bended twigs or grass or the print of their shoes, and generally of what sex or age or quality they were, by some slight trace left as a flower dropped or a bunch of grass plucked and thrown away, even as far off as the railroad half a mile distant, or by the lingering odor of a cigar or pipe. Nay, I was frequently notified of the passage of a traveler along the highway 60 rods off by the scent of his pipe. I have to point out as a sidebar here, on a personal note, I found myself having the exact same experience as this in the mountains in Big Bear. Not because I am interning under some mystical Native American tracker that shows me the way of the wolf, the boar, and the print of the deer, or but more because I've become so intimately acquainted with the mountain itself, with the ecosystem, with the forest, with the animals that live there, with the plants, that when something is slightly out of place, it now jumps out to me. It jumps out to me like a $20 bill on the sidewalk. When there is an animal that lives on the other side of the mountain from where I'm standing, and I hear that animal's alarm call, it jumps out to me as something that is temporarily out of place. And very much is the same for human-based smells, such as cigarette smoke, cigars and pipes, not so commonly, but I can't not notice these things now. Back to Walden. There is commonly sufficient space about us. Our horizon is never quite at our elbows. The thick wood is not just at our door, nor the pond, but somewhat is always clearing, familiar and worn by us, appropriated and fenced in some way and reclaimed from nature. For what reason have I this vast range and circuit some square miles of unfrequented forest? For my privacy, abandoned to me by men? My nearest neighbor is a mile distant, and no house is visible from any place but the hilltops within a half a mile of my own. I have my horizon bounded by woods all to myself. A distant view of the railroad where it touches the pond on the one hand, and of the fence which skirts the woodland road on the other. But, for the most part, it is as solitary where I live as on the prairies. It is as much Asia or Africa as it is New England. I have, as it were, my own sun and moon and stars, and a little world all to myself. At night, there was never a traveler passed by my house or knocked at my door, more than if I were the first or last man, unless it were in the spring, when at long intervals some came from the village to fish. They plainly fished much more in the Walden Pond of their own natures, and baited their hooks with darkness. But they soon retreated, usually with light baskets, and left the world to darkness and to me. And the black kernel of the night was never profaned by any human neighborhood. I believe that men are generally still a little afraid of the dark, though the witches are all hung, and Christianity and candles have been introduced. Yet, I experienced sometimes that the most sweet and tender, the most innocent and encouraging society may be found in any natural object, even for the poor misanthrope and the most melancholy man. There can be no very black melancholy to him who lives in the midst of nature and has his senses still. There was never yet such a storm, but it was aeolian music to a healthy and innocent ear. Nothing can rightly compel a simple and brave man to a vulgar sadness. For all the while that I enjoy the friendship of the seasons, I trust that nothing can make life a burden to me. The gentle rain water, which waters my beans and keeps me in the house today, is not too drear and melancholy, but good for me too. Though it prevents my hoeing them, it is of far more worth than my hoeing. If it should continue so long as to cause the seeds to rot in the ground and destroy the potatoes in the lowlands, it would still be good for the grass on the uplands. And being good for the grass, it would be good for me. Sometimes, when I compare myself with other men, it seems as if I were more favored by the gods than they, beyond any deserts that I'm conscious of. As if I had a warrant and surety at their hands, which my fellows have not, and were especially guided and guarded. I do not flatter myself, but if it be possible, they flatter me. I've never felt lonesome or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude. But once, and that was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when for an hour I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. To be alone was something unpleasant, but I was at the same time conscious of a slight insanity in my mood and seemed to foresee my recovery. In the midst of a gentle rain, while these thoughts prevailed, I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very pattering of the drops, and in every sound and sight around my house, an infinite and unaccountable friendliness, all at once like an atmosphere sustaining me, has made the fancied advantages of human neighborhood insignificant, and I have never thought of them since. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled with sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me, even in scenes which we are accustomed to call wild and dreary, and also that the nearest of blood to me and humanness was not a person nor a villager, that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again. Some of my pleasantest hours were during the long rainstorms in the spring or fall, which confined me to the house for the afternoon, as well as the forenoons soothed by their ceaseless roar and pelting, when an early twilight ushered in a long evening in which many thoughts had time to take root and unfold themselves. In those driving northeast rains, which tried the village houses so, when the maids stood ready with mop and pail in front entries to keep the deluge out, I sat behind my door in my little house, which was all entry, and thoroughly enjoyed its protection. In one heavy thunder shower, the lightning struck a large pitch pine across the pond, making a very conspicuous and perfectly regular spiral groove from top to bottom, an inch or more deep and 4 or 5 inches wide, as you would groove a walking stick. I passed it again the other day and was struck with awe on looking up and beholding that mark, now more distinct than ever, where a terrific and restless bolt came down out of the harmless sky 8 years ago. Men frequently say to me, "I think you would feel lonesome down there and want to be nearer to folks, rainy and snowy days and nights especially." I'm tempted to reply to such, this whole earth which we inhabit is but a point in space. How far apart, think you, dwell the two most distant inhabitants of yonder star, the breadth of whose disk cannot be appreciated by our instruments? Why should I feel lonely? Is not our planet in the Milky Way? This which you put seems to me not to be the most important question. What sort of space is that which separates a man from his fellows and makes him solitary? I have found that no exertion of the legs can bring two minds much nearer to one another. What do we want most to dwell near to? Not to many men, surely. The depot, the post office, the bar room, the meeting house, the schoolhouse, the grocery, Beacon Hill, or the 5 Points where men most congregate, but to the perennial source of our life, whence in all our experience we have found that to issue as the willow stands near the water and sends out its roots in that direction, this will vary with different natures, but this is the place where a wise man will dig his cellar. I, one evening, overtook one of my townsmen who has accumulated what is called a handsome property, though I never got a fair view of it, on the Walden Road driving a pair of cattle to market. He inquired of me how I could bring my mind to give up so many of the comforts of life. I answered that I was very sure I liked it passably well. I was not joking. And so I went home to my bed and left him to pick his way through the darkness and the mud to Brighton or Bright Town, which place he would reach sometime in the morning. Any prospect of awakening or coming to life to a dead man makes indifferent all times and places. The place where that may occur is always the same and indescribably pleasant to all our senses. For the most part, we allow only outlying and transient circumstances to make our occasions. They are, in fact, the cause of our distraction. Nearest to all things is that power which fashions their being. Next to us, the grandest laws are continually being executed. Next to us is not the workman whom we have hired, with whom we love so well to talk, but the workman whose work we are. I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our chambers. A man thinking or working is always alone. Let him be where he will. Solitude is not measured by the miles of space that intervene between a man and his fellows. The really diligent student in one of the crowded hives of Cambridge College is as solitary as a dervish in the desert. The farmer can work alone in the field or the woods all day, hoeing or chopping, and not feel lonesome because he is employed. But when he comes home at night, he cannot sit down in a room alone at the mercy of his thoughts, but must be where he can see the folks and recreate and, as he thinks, remunerate himself for his day's solitude. And hence he wonders how all the student can sit alone in the house all night and most of the day without ennui and the blues. But he does not realize that the student, though in his house, is still at work in his field and chopping in his woods as the farmer in his, and in turn seeks the same recreation and society that the latter does, though it may be a more condensed form of it. I can relate to this extremely poignantly, because I can't enumerate the number of times that I've been in a city or on a stage in front of a really big crowd, and yet feeling utterly alone, profoundly isolated. By contrast, the number of times that it was just me and Wolfgang in a cabin in the woods, and I never felt alone, and I didn't feel like I was robbed of good company. But back to Walden. I have a great deal of company in my house, especially in the morning when nobody calls. Let me suggest a few comparisons that someone may convey an idea of my situation. I am no more lonely than the loon in the pond that laughs so loud, or than Walden Pond itself. What company has that lonely lake, I ask, and yet it has not the blue devils, but the blue angels in it. In the azure tent of its waters, the sun is alone except in thick weather, when there sometimes appears to be two, but one is a mock sun. I am no more lonely than a single mullein or a dandelion in a pasture, or a bean leaf, or sorrel, or a horsefly, or a bumblebee. I am no more lonely than the millbrook, or a weathercock, or the North Star, or the south wind, or an April shower, or a January thaw, or the first spider in a new house. I have occasional visits in the long winter evenings, when the snow falls fast and the wind howls in the wood, from an old settler and original proprietor who is reported to have dug Walden Pond and stoned it and fringed it with pine woods, who tells me stories of old time and of new eternity, and between us we manage to pass a cheerful evening with a social mirth and pleasant view of things, even without apples or cider. A most wise and humorous friend whom I love so much, who keeps himself secret, and though he is thought to be dead, none can show where he is buried. An elderly dame, too, dwells in my neighborhood, invisible to most persons, in whose odorous herb garden I love to stroll sometimes, gathering simples and listening to her fables, for she has a genius of unequaled fertility, and her memory runs farther back than mythology, and she can tell me the original of every fable and on what fact every one is founded. For the incidents occurred when she was young. A ruddy and lusty old dame, she delights in all weathers and seasons and is likely to outlive all her children yet. This indescribable innocence and beneficence of nature, of sun and wind and rain, of summer and winter, such health, such cheer they afford forever, and such sympathy have they ever with our race, that all nature would be affected, and the sun's brightness fade, and the winds would sigh humanely, and the clouds rain tears, and the woods shed their leaves, and put on mourning in midsummer, if any man should ever for a just cause grieve. Shall I not have intelligence with the earth? Am I not partly leaves and vegetable mold myself? What is the pill which will keep us well, keep us serene, keep us contented? Not my or thy great-grandfathers, but our great-grandmother Nature's universal vegetable, botanic medicines, by which she has kept herself young always, outlived so many in her day. For my panacea, instead of one of those quack vials of a mixture dipped from the Dead Sea, let me have a draught of undiluted morning air. Morning air. If men will not drink of this at the fountainhead of the day, why then we must even bottle up some of it and sell it in the shops for the benefit of those who have lost their subscription ticket to morning time in this world. But remember, it will not keep till noonday, even in the coolest cellar. But drive out the stopples long ere that and follow westward to the steps of Aurora. I'm no worshiper of Hygeia, who was the daughter of that old herb doctor Escapulus, and who is represented on monuments holding a serpent in one hand and in the other a cup out of which the serpent sometimes drinks, but rather of Hebe, cupbearer to Jupiter, who was the daughter of Juno and wild lettuce, and who had the power of restoring gods and men to the vigor of youth. She was probably the only thoroughly sound-conditioned, healthy, and robust young lady that ever walked the globe. And wherever she came, it was spring. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Produced by GWC Productions. The show is dedicated to the memory of my best friend, Wolfgang Beastly. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura, on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T Uverse Channel 99